Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak for 15 minutes in morning business, and I ask that the chair please notify me when I have 3 minutes remaining.
We'll do so without objection.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, President Obama in his State of the Union address and Vice President Biden ever since have been talking about their efforts to help students afford to go to college, which is something we're all in favor of. The president's proposal is what he calls a higher education race to the top. And it has a familiar sounding formula, though. And in this case, it's new rules and mandates and price controls on colleges and universities and states. Unfortunately, this race to the top, Mr. President, is headed in the wrong direction. The president should turn around his higher education race to the top and head it toward Washington, D.C., and help Washington compete to look for ways to stop from adding costs on states and colleges that are soaking up dollars and driving college tuition through the roof. Let me be specific and offer 3 examples of how a race to the top headed toward Washington, D.C. could actually help students by saving them money on their tuition. Number 1, Washington could stop overcharging students on their student loans. They're doing that now by borrowing money at 2.8% and loaning it to students at 6.8% and using the profit to help pay for the health care law and for other government programs. Number 2, it would help students with lower tuition if Washington would repeal the new Medicaid mandates on states that take effect in 2014, because these new Medicaid mandates will further reduce state funding for higher education and raise tuition at public colleges and universities, which is where 70% of college students go, 75%. Third, Washington should stop prohibiting states from reducing spending on Medicaid at a time when state revenues and expenditures are going down. That forces states to spend money on health care that otherwise would be available for higher education. Let me talk about each of those 3 ideas. First, this business of overcharging on student loans. I think it would come as a big surprise to most students to know that Washington is borrowing money at 2.8% and loaning it to them at 6.8% and using the profit to pay for the health care law and for other government programs. We've got roughly 25 million students attending 6,000 colleges and universities in America today. Approximately 16 million of those have federal loans that allow them to spend that money at the school of their choice. Approximately 70% of the federal funding made available for our higher education last year, about $116 billion, went for those student loans. Now, under the new health care law, the Department of Education is going to be borrowing money at 2.8% and then loaning it to the students at 6.8%. So the government's actually overcharging 16 million students and taking that profit and spending it on new government programs, including the new health care law. Now, this is according to the Congressional Budget Office. Over the next 10 years, according to CBO, here is where the profit goes approximately. $8.7 billion goes to pay for the new health care law. $10.3 billion goes to pay down the federal debt. $36 billion goes to support other Pell Grants. So if we really want to help students pay for tuition, why wouldn't we use this profit from overcharging on student loans to reduce the interest rate on student loans? CBO says we could reduce it from 6.8% to 5.3%, let students have the savings instead of let the government have the savings. By reducing the interest on student loans that much, students would save an average of $2,200 over 10 years. That's a lot of money for the average student borrower who has approximately $25,000 in debt. Mr. President, I have proposed that we have legislation that puts a truth in lending label on every one of the 16 million student loans, and it says this: beware. Your government's overcharging you on your student loan to help pay for the health care law and other government programs. Second, Here's a second way that Washington could help lower tuition rates. Washington could repeal the Medicaid mandates on states that take effect in 2014 and that inevitably will help drive up tuition rates. This is how that works. A new health care law requires states to expand and help pay for Medicaid coverage. This, in turn, requires governors who are making up budgets to take money that otherwise would likely go for higher education and spend it instead on Medicaid. According to the Congressional Budget Office, this new expansion of Medicaid will cost states $20 billion over 10 years and add $16 million to the Medicaid program. The CMS actuary says it may be 25 million people to the Medicaid program, costing states even more. Now, we know this is what's going to happen because it's already happening. Medicaid mandates for years have been forcing huge costs on states that in turn soak up money for colleges, which in turn causes tuition to go up to replace that money. According to the Kaiser Foundation, state funding this year for Medicaid increased by 28.7% over the prior year. Well, where'd the money come from? Well, in Tennessee, which had a 15.8% increase in Medicaid last year in state spending, at the same time, there was a 15% decrease in state spending for higher education. That's a real cut, not a Washington cut. That's 15% less money. And that did what? There was a 7.3% increase in tuition at public universities and an 8.2% increase at community colleges to make up for the cuts. In California, where they enroll 8.3 million Medicaid beneficiaries, they're expected to gain 2 million more when the new health care law is implemented in 2014. Just over the last year, there's been a 13.5% decrease in state support for higher education, along with a 21% increase at state colleges and a 37% increase in tuition at state universities. Most of those students probably don't know the principal reason their tuition rates are going up is because of federal health care mandates on the states. From 2006, spending by state governments on Medicaid increased by 62.6%. So this has been going on long before President Obama came into office. I battled it as governor in the 1980s. Every year, I tried to keep education funding at 50% of the state budget. In those, the state paid 70% of the cost of operating the University of Tennessee or the community college. Tuition paid 30%. And we had an implicit deal with the students that if we raise tuition, we'll raise state funding by about the same amount. Those days are long gone. Medicaid costs on states are the most insoluble part of the budget dilemma that we have here in Washington. I believe states' Medicaid should either be run 100% by the federal government or 100% by the states. I came to Washington and suggested that to President Reagan in the 1980s when I was governor. He agreed, but not many others did. So it's not new. We shouldn't blame President Obama for the fact this has gone on for 30 years, but we ought to hold him responsible for making it worse. Here's how he's made it worse in another way. By a so-called maintenance of effort requirement on states as a condition of continuing to receive federal payments under Medicaid. The 2009 stimulus bill prohibited states from imposing new eligibility standards, methodologies, or procedures as a condition of receiving federal Medicaid payments. The new health care law extends the maintenance of effort requirements through 2014. So, for 5 years throughout this recession, while state revenues are going down, the federal government, in its wisdom, has been imposing on states billions of new dollars in Medicaid mandates requiring states to spend more on Medicaid, and what happens? They must spend less on something else. In 2010, the New York Lieutenant Governor, Richard Ravitch, a Democrat, eloquently talked about that. He said Medicaid's the largest single driver of New York's expenditures, 1/3 of the state budget. New York spent twice as much on Medicaid as California. He said the spending would grow 18% over the next 4 years, but that the federal stimulus and health care expansions made it harder for states like New York and California to cut expenditures because of the strings attached. He said, quote, "These strings prevent states from substituting federal money for state funds. require states to spend minimum amounts of their own funds, and prevent states from tightening eligibility standards for benefits. So while the federal government, that was the end of the quote, is burdening the states with hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicaid liabilities, the president's made it worse by forbidding states from tightening their eligibility requirements as their economies shrink. The administration and the Congress has left governors with little choice but to cut in other areas, and that usually turns out to be public higher education, where 75% of students go to school. So why is tuition going up? The biggest reason is us, the Congress, Washington, D.C. So instead of pointing the finger at states and colleges, we ought to look in the mirror. There's another problem with the president's proposals. His proposals are not likely to affect many students. And if they do, they're more likely to hurt them than help them. Here's why that's true. 90% of all federal money made available to students goes directly to the students. They spend it at the 6,000 institutions, one of their choice. The president's proposals would only affect 3 programs of student-based aid that go to about 2% of all students, and 2% of all the money available is affected by those programs. What the president would propose doing is putting price controls on colleges offering those programs and saying students couldn't go there if tuition goes up too much at an institution. So if a low-income student wants to go to the University of Tennessee or North Carolina or Michigan, and tuition goes up more than the federal government says it should, mostly because of federal policies, what happens? The student can't go to the University of Michigan or the University of Tennessee or the University of North Carolina. Now, those schools have plenty of applicants. They're going to get their students. So the effect is to make it harder for a low-income student to go to the college of his or her choice. What should we be doing? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The taxpayers already are generous with students going to college. The average tuition at a 4-year institution that's public is $8,200. At a 2-year community college is $3,000. While at private institutions, it may be closer to $28,000 or $30,000 a year. To make it easier, there's 16 million loans, $116 billion in money for new student loans this year.
Senator has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. 9 million Pell Grants, $41 billion in taxpayers' dollars. So half our 25 million college students have a federal grant or a loan to help pay for college, and they spend it at one of 6,000 institutions. Still, the rising cost of tuition is a real problem for American families. Tuition and fees have soared over the past 10 years above the rate of inflation by 5.6% a year. At public 4-year universities, this adds up to about 113% over the decade. Colleges and universities need to do their part to cut costs. I've suggested well-prepared students ought to be offered 3-year degrees instead of 4. The president of George Washington University has suggested ways that colleges could be more efficient. He said you could run 2 complete colleges with 2 complete faculties in the facilities now used half the year for 1. That's without cutting the length of student vacations, increasing class size, or requiring faculty to teach more. And requiring 1 mandatory summer session for every student in every 4 years, as Dartmouth does, would improve, so the GW president said, his institution's bottom line by 10 to 15 million a year. Those are just 2 good ideas. And there's nothing wrong with President Obama's proposal to encourage ideas like that, even to give grants and aid and put the spotlight on colleges that are trying those things. The Malcolm Baldrige Award for Quality Control years ago did a lot to improve quality in business and in government without spending very much money. But mandates and price controls on 6,000 autonomous colleges and universities are not the right prescription. They're more likely to hurt students than help. They're more likely to drive up tuition than lower it, and they're more likely to diminish the quality of the best system of higher education in the world. The reason we have the best system is, for one reason, because generally the federal government keeps its hands off those autonomous colleges, and the second reason is students can choose among those 6,000 institutions with the money we make available to them for grants and loans. So, Mr. President, rather than creating new price controls, new mandates, and new regulations of the kind that have already made tuition higher, I suggest the President turn his race to the top around. Instead of heading it toward the states and colleges, head it toward Washington, D.C. Stop overcharging students for their student loans. Stop requiring states to spend state dollars on health care at the expense of public colleges and universities. Repeal the new Medicaid mandates that in 2014 will take already high tuition and drive it even higher. Let the federal agencies compete to see how they can stop adding costs that are the main reason college tuition is rising. That would be the real race to the top. That is the real way to help students afford college. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.